One of the things I want to stress, and this is a kind of a important point in my mind, and this is something to think about as you go forward in your careers as well, is that in many cases computer science is a team sport, and in this case it definitely is a team activity. We like doing collaborative research at Carnegie Mellon, and therefore for me it's important to acknowledge the fact that it's a decent sized team. As he said, there's two acts. In the first act, I'm going to be mostly talking about Tiasu, a system that we have in Pittsburgh for public transit. And the core faculty involved in this are myself, Anthony Tomasic, John Zimmerman, Charlie Garrett, and Yan Huang. Some of you may know John Zimmerman. He's relatively well known in the HCI communities. In the robotics part, where I start talking about more physical interactions with things, Brandon Diaz and myself are the ones doing that work. I do want to stress that in all of these projects, we have very strong ties to our stakeholders. It's really important, especially when doing research related to people with disabilities, to always be in contact with your end users. And this allows us to have a lot of direct input from people with disabilities, especially people who are blind. Also, we work very closely with the Port Authority of Allegheny County. Here in the Bay Area, you've got a gazillion different transit agencies. In the Pittsburgh region, we basically only have one. They're woefully underfunded, but very eager to work with us, and so it's been really helpful to have their insights and knowledge. Transit is a way more complex experience than you think about. And of course, we've had a number of class projects and stuff. Now, just to give you a sense as to the size and scale of this effort, this is a non-ordered list, well, roughly chronological list of all the different students, postdocs, and staff who've worked on this project, on these projects, and I've probably left a few off because it's just so hard to keep track. I'm trying to think if there's any highlights in here. He's probably, I don't know if he's actually here. Is Rafay, are you here? Rafay is here, okay. Yeah, see, the beard threw me. So Rafay was one of our early undergrads. He's now at VMware. Feel free to bother him and pester him after the session if you want to ask him what it was like working on this team way back in the day. Okay, so our core funding for this research comes from an agency that cares a lot about people with disabilities, and in particular, we are funded to do work on accessible public transportation. This is actually a topic I could spend an entire seminar talking about, but I'm just going to summarize it here. This provides you the context as to why we care about this particular issue and why we're doing the work that we're doing. There's a lot of very strong statistics that people with disabilities rely on public transit to a degree that is rather significant. If you think about it, in the United States, we're a very car-oriented culture. If you are unable to drive a car because of a particular disability, or your income is so low that you can't afford a modified vehicle, public transit becomes really important to your daily life. Employment, social inclusion, seeing your friends and family, getting to your doctor, all these things become much more challenging. Just as an aside, modified vehicles, just to understand, can cost well upwards of a Tesla. We'll just put it in that context. Okay, so, and of course you can't resell it because it's been modified for you. So I want to particularly highlight this notion that most of you are students, you're thinking about getting jobs. The biggest thing in finding a job is an appropriate job for what you want to do. Just like that with people with disabilities, it's 50%, but the next highest is actually getting to the job. And that kind of gives a sense as to how big a deal this is. So another kind of key part to this work, and this is what really draws in Anthony and John, is the combination of this being a very large-scale big data problem, but also a design problem. So most of you probably ride a bus or a train on a pretty regular basis. Your students, that's pretty normal. But what you may not realize is that there's a significant amount of complexity behind the delivery of that service. And that complexity really makes things difficult and challenging from the context of doing anything as a ubiquitous computing or participatory sensing approach. And so you can try a variety of different techniques, but in the end, there's always this missing link, and that's where human interaction can really make a big impact in terms of what you're trying to do. It's not a strictly quantifiable experience either. There's an enormous amount of stakeholder involvement that changes the way the service is delivered. This can be as simple as someone who happens to live across the street from a bus stop really hating that the buses are always there every day and trying to subvert the delivery of that service. This can also be something like a politician who really insists on a particular transit route staying even though it's completely inefficient and threatening to cut funding to the transit agency. These sorts of things happen. And then finally, there's all sorts of other factors like historic vehicles. How do you make these things accessible and so forth? So this is an example as to why an interdisciplinary approach is necessary for these sorts of things. So we take an approach that combines design, large-scale data, a lot of deep knowledge about the context of the domain. We've even had projects involving computer vision on mobile phones. And some of our work that's done by our partners up in SUNY Buffalo is in the physical space, trying to understand, getting down to the level of, if I change the layout of this bus, how does that affect the ability for people to get on and off the bus quickly? So they have a full-blown bus with a Vicon system and everything. Now, there are two approaches to dealing with accessibility. One of the techniques that's used is the more traditional assistive technology. A wheelchair is a good example of this. These are typically products or systems that are designed for a specific capability or a specific disability. They're very effective at delivering service, but you have a niche product problem. In that, in many cases, there's only one or two companies providing this particular technology because there's such a small market. There's not enough people to buy it, so you can't support a large industry. So this has led to a number of problems over the years in the accessibility community, where a lot of technologies become orphaned because the person who's behind that company is usually a one or two person company. Something happens in their lives and they're no longer doing the business, and so that product just disappears off the market, and any research or any sort of development that went into it is gone. And so the funding agencies have become increasingly concerned about this particular problem, and so they advocate a technique called universal design wherever possible. You still need assistive technology, that's critical. But in some cases, you can get by with what's called universal design. And transit is a really good example of this. So back in the day, buses used to be high floor buses. You used to have to climb the steps to get up in the bus. School buses are like this. So city buses are like that. In many countries, they still are. But in the United States, you're seeing more and more of them down at the low floor bus style. And that's intentional for a number of different reasons. The first and foremost is that people get on and off the bus faster because you're not climbing steps. It's a lot safer because people aren't tripping and falling out of the stairs, down the stairs. But if you use a wheelchair, all of a sudden that means that the grade change is significantly smaller. So with multiple steps, you had to essentially have a miniature elevator that would come out, it's called a lift, that would come out from the stairs and raise a person up and bring them in. These things are these really complex mechanical structures. They break all the time because it's a niche product, niche manufacturer, niche maintenance. So the approach of low floor vehicles makes the mechanism much smaller, much simpler, because you're only trying to do a grade change of a small amount, and so you can get by with a flip out ramp or a telescoping ramp. And those sorts of systems survive abuse much better because they're simpler and so forth. But what's also happening is you're seeing the same basic ideas in terms of providing space for a wheelchair in a bus to also be used for providing space for other users as well. So wheelchairs, in many vehicles, the wheelchair space is also the same space that might get used by a stroller, luggage, a bicycle, so forth. Other vehicles, they make it in separate spaces, but the idea is that universal value to a lot of different users. The other thing to keep in mind about universal design approaches is that even if the vast majority of your user base does not have a disability, there's still cases where they do have a functional disability for that particular scenario. So, if it's a rainy, dreary night and you've got your hood up, now all of a sudden you have restricted peripheral vision. In the dark, you have restricted color perception. So all these different things start adding up, and you essentially have a disability. There's probably at least one bar here in town that keeps captioning on the TV all the time because you can't hear the TV. So that's an example of a scenario-based disability. And a number of you probably ride your bikes with headphones on and you can't hear a thing around you. You're effectively deaf while you're riding your bike. So universal design helps solve these problems. Another core techniques that we use is that was interesting. We are generally applying technology and crowdsourcing in both areas to try and make a difference. And they do stitch together because both techniques actually have some crowdsourcing elements to them, both from the smartphone approach, which is the Tiasu project, but also in our transit station helper robots project. Just as a kind of a prelude to this before I get deep into the Tiasu case, people ask, why would you need a robot to help in a transit station? There are lots of transit stations that are really hard to navigate, really confusing. Even if you're sighted, a brand new transit station, for example, has this crude user design hack of a rather easy to read wayfinding technique for sighted users. But you can imagine how difficult it is to get around a complex, confusing transit station if you're blind. Furthermore, if you can't see the way crowds are moving through the spaces and you don't understand where the bottlenecks are in terms of crowds. So I'll come back to this in a bit, but I want to more focus on smartphones right now. So like any good HCI approach, we started from the beginning with human-centered techniques, interviews, focus groups, various other design explorations. Rafay was active in some of these particular projects. And one of the early papers is this one here back in 2010. And this included efforts related to service design, service blueprinting, trying to understand where the various breakdowns in service delivery were, where the different problems occurred. Keep in mind that under the ADA and other regulations, transit is supposed to be, by default, accessible. And it generally is. But where you run into problems with accessibility in public transit, it tends to be because of a service breakdown. A driver saying that their lift is broken when it's not. A newspaper company putting their newspaper box in the wrong spot at a bus stop, then now it blocks access to the vehicle. It can be something as simple as failing to clear snow out of a bus stop and resulting in an icy sheet around the bus stop area. And so these sorts of breakdowns are actually the source of the vast majority of the accessibility problems. So we went through this process and came back with a core approach that we wanted to pursue, which is a co-design approach. And the idea is that the people who are using the public transit also could provide value to improve that service delivery. This already happens in a number of systems that you already use. The ratings on Amazon, the ratings on Yelp, these are examples of co-production of value in a system where your end users are making that system more valuable and there's shared value to everybody through the process. And the question was, could we do this in public transit? And this was motivated by two particular data needs that our end users highlighted to us. The first is that if you have a disability, you want to know when the bus is going to show up. I mean, we all want to know, but if you have a disability, it's really important for a number of different reasons. First, whether it's true or not, there's definitely a perceived perception that you are going to get mugged. You're more likely to get mugged if you have a disability. They do tend to get mugged more often. You also have this issue of exposure to inclement weather. If you have particular disabilities, exposure to cold, rain, that sort of thing can be much more severe in terms of your health than people without disabilities. And finally, it does take, so for some people, their mobility is somewhat slow, so it does take some time to get to a stop. So knowing good information helps in that regard. The fullness one was an interesting one. We didn't even think about this, and I've been in this space for a while now, and it didn't even occur to me until one of our participants kind of uttered that one line that changes the course of your research, and this happens to researchers in all sorts of fields, where he said, this particular thing you're working on is really cool, I like it, but if the bus is full, I can't get on. So yeah, because his wheelchair takes up a lot of space. Actually, technically, in some locations, the bus driver is supposed to kick people off to make room for a wheelchair user. You can imagine how many bus drivers actually do this. So this particular piece of data was really important to us, and we realized there were other people with other types of disabilities where knowing if you're going to be able to get a seat or not is really, really useful. So from this, we said we'll go after these 2 points, but then we kind of got into this issue of, well, if you're doing crowdsourcing or a co-design type approach, you're not going to get perfect results. So we do want to get a sense as to what's good enough to provide value to everybody. And then we have this kind of long range, let's hope it works kind of idea out there. If you live in London or certain boroughs in New York City, you have a very strong positive brand identity to your transit agency, right? You know, the Underground, you know, or the particular train in Brooklyn or something like that. It means something to you. It has value. It's a source of pride. Most transit agencies, this is not true, right? They're a means to an ends rather than the ends. And so therefore, it's just something you have to put up with to get through your life. One of the questions is that by generating this co-design experience, could you hopefully maybe create a better sense of ownership for the for that particular transit system so that you feel more connected to your transit agency. And this has strong implications in terms of digital government and other things like that, because most transit agencies are heavily subsidized by your taxes. The fares are actually relatively small. Well, they're not cheap, but the fares actually do have less impact on the budgets as maybe the taxes do, which is why they're so susceptible to funding problems at the government. So to summarize kind of where we are now, and then I'll kind of back into some of the stories behind this, I wanted to give you a sense of the system. We've been deployed now since 2011. When you want to provide information about a vehicle, a particular bus, you click on that, you tell everybody where you're going, and then the system asks you to say how full the bus is and then start recording, and then you record your trip. That information is fed back into the system as real-time data using machine learning techniques, and then that's shared with all the other riders. If we don't have someone on a particular bus, but we have a lot of data for that particular bus, we're pretty sure we can give you an estimate, we'll generate out a historic data as well. And historic data sometimes has fullness, sometimes it doesn't. It kind of depends on the confidence we have in the distribution. This approach has worked very well. As I said, we've been deployed for a while. We have both Android and iPhone. And we are technically deployed in New York City and Syracuse, but we haven't advertised and haven't recruited participants there. So it works there, but you won't see any interesting data. But mostly in Pittsburgh, we've generated 183,250 trip contribution data points from people. This is not counting how often people have opened the app and used it without contributing. This is just the actual trips, not how long that, so you only get counted once basically on your trip. As an aside, by going out and deploying this and doing research in the wild, we've kind of raised our profile among the community, and in the process picked up a couple innovation awards that typically are not the sorts of things that you get when you're a researcher. So this was a kind of a nice thing to do, and it's worth considering as a nice byproduct of doing research in the wild, and sponsors love it. So we started with a closed field test. We wanted to test out the system, make sure it worked, kind of check out all the bugs, sort out all the problems. If you do research with people with disabilities, these sorts of pilot tests, these sorts of small-scale kind of is it working tests, you typically do not recruit people with disabilities. They are a limited resource, and you don't want to run out of people with disabilities. So quite often you will recruit regular people to test, people without disabilities to test out ideas. So this was actually people without disabilities, but we recruited them from a specific part of town, the Oakland area, if you're familiar with Pittsburgh, and set them loose. And we paid them for their time. So because we paid them, they probably traced more than they normally would, and we ended up with about just over half of the rides being traced. Even with this small number of people and the number of all possible trips that they could experience and see, they actually saw about 13% value added. I should explain what an impression is. Each one of these rows is an impression in our terminology. So if you are, so this is one impression and so forth. So of the impressions that they saw, because we log it so we know what they saw, 6% were real time, 7% historic. And this is with just only 28 people as they're running around using the app. So this was really cool, but also very cool was that people were using the report function. We have a little report function on the app that allows people to document things they experienced that are kind of more single instance things like a broken seat that someone encountered and took a picture of. And when we've done it in our early work, we asked people, how often do you call up the transit agency? How often do you file a form on their web page? And the answer for most people without disabilities is 0. How many of you have ever contacted a transit agency with a comment or complaint? Twitter does not count. This actually was before transit agencies started getting active in Twitter. Yeah, so very low. But now all of a sudden we have all these reports coming in from people because it's there in their hands and easy to do. And of course, the traditional metrics came back very high as well. Yeah?
Just a detailed question. You
yeah.
said that they traced about half their rides. How do you know, what was the denominator were they
We know when they open the app.
Okay, but so they may have taken rides where they never...
Right. Half of for the times that they opened the app, we of those, yeah, about half.
Okay.
Yeah. We treat this, we also take a sessions-based approach based on a 15-minute window. So if you open the app and then go to like your calendar and come back or something, that's just once.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So getting on as an aside, this report function, this is actually something we thought we wanted to do very early on, something that was important for people with disabilities. Again, the breakdowns, these service breakdowns, these random problems out in the middle of nowhere at a bus stop that the ADA coordinator for a transit agency might never go to. How do you document these experiences? And we looked at the traditional forms, a call center and web forms. These are the typical techniques. And so these in a mobile context fall into an audio call or something like a Twitter or text message type of documentation of something. And we crossed that against no media, photos, and videos. So it was a 2x3. And what came out of this work is that almost everybody prefers the text and photo combination. Furthermore, all of the quality metrics we had raters check the results in terms of what people documented, come back as text and photo is the right approach as well. To be clear, Port Authority was going to let us take a bus shelter from their graveyard. But we're going to need a crane truck, and we're going to have to chop it up and then re-rivet it back together. And it was looking like it was going to be really hard to do that. And so we built a fake bus shelter in our lab, complete with a 12x12 banner of a backdrop scene, tempered glass, the whole deal. Brought in an industrial designer, doing a really good job on various different things. And it came back with text and photo. And the theory that we have as to why stems from a particular metric on one of the survey data points, which was social comfort. People had much higher social comfort when doing text versus audio. So you're standing at the bus stop and you're documenting a problem, and so it's more comfortable from a social context to use text. Any idea why? What's wrong with audio? It's private. So text is private, right? Everyone knows you are complaining. You pull out that phone and you start telling someone about a problem. Everyone around you immediately knows you're complaining. And so we think that that's a strong effect in this particular context. Having said this, people with specific disabilities have trouble typing large amounts of text into phones. So we still do provide a call button that goes straight to the agency.
So I've got a bit of a different interpretation here. I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could help me piece this out. It seems like maybe what's going on here is not about the privacy, or it may be playing a role.
There's multiple measures, but yeah.
But it seems like it's about also like the social comfort seems like it may be about who's the audience. Am I complaining to the authority, or am I telling others?
Right. So in this particular study, was you're telling the agency about a problem that you're experiencing. Yes.
Right. Well, so.
And this held true for both people with disabilities and without disabilities.
But in the app, you're telling other people.
I'll get to that.
Right?
You're actually one slide ahead. I'll get to that in a second. Before I forget, though, one of the things that we would like to do is be able to support the photo capability for people who are blind. And so one of the students came up with a technique that allows the system to improve the image composition of a picture. So if you're blind, you can roughly aim the camera, but your image composition is probably going to be somewhat difficult to get right. And so computer vision runs locally on the phone in real time to help you take a better picture using sound feedback. That particular code is not in our app. It burns CPU like nobody's business because it fires up the GPU. But that particular code is actually available on GitHub, and it's Marinelle will be presenting this particular 2Chi paper at Chi next week. So if you're curious about that, you can find her in the audience and get pointers to that. Yeah, during the study, we got interesting things like someone asked to take a picture of their dog that had come with them. So people who are blind do like taking pictures. So anyway, going to your question of the report. So when we released the system out to the wild, we intentionally triaged every single report that came in. For a big chunk of time, we did this. We took the first 1,000 reports that came in, and a pair of undergrads sat through and coded them all. For you guys, it's coding.
Never do this instead.
Yeah.
Love you.
Yeah. We were talking over lunch about coding eye tracking by hand, frame by frame. So the kind of the short story as to what came out of this is that people are more than willing to document point of pain experiences in mobile apps. The Twitter is a good example of a technique that's actually used nowadays pretty well by a lot of transit agencies. Furthermore, people who don't have disabilities actually documented cases of what they perceived as discrimination and sent that in. And that was something we suspected might happen, but we weren't really sure it would happen, so we were rather pleased to see it occurring. But by and large, an underlying effect that came out of this is a real strong desire for a dialogue to occur between the riders and their agency, or at least riders and riders as well. And so actually, we're going through a major update of our software right now, and in large part to support that particular capability. As the years went on, we had continued discussions with the transit agency. We had been triaging out the ones that were specific to the transit agency and forwarding them along to the agency. But it turns out that, yeah, they're useful, they're interesting, they're valuable to them, but they can't actually take action on any data that came in. So even though discrimination was being seen by people, they couldn't do anything about it because of the way that the union contract rules were set up that prohibited them from using our data for disciplinary action because of the way that we had been set up in our structure. We weren't really trying to do this. This was a byproduct of what we were doing. We thought maybe they might use it for it, but they can't. Yeah?
Specifically for disciplinary action or for just fixing things?
Well, the union rules are very specific to disciplinary action, yeah. For fixing things, there is evidence that these sorts of systems do have appeal to agencies. See-click fix is still going on, things like that. But that wasn't, we were interested in whether or not they would use this, but our results were probably heavily biased by our particular agency. During this process, Port Authority was going through massive budget cuts. So they barely had enough people to even answer the phone, much less read our stuff and send it forward to the necessary person. So unfortunately, in our context, probably the wrong place at the wrong time. It's interesting walking into Port Authority's offices. I used to go in for a different project years ago, back when funding was fine. It's like a ghost town now compared to what it used to be. So this is probably an artifact of them just not having the labor to chase these things down. Which is another reason why we're going to a more dialogue-based model so that riders can help each other with information about things. So the nice thing about having a system that's used by a large number of people for a number of years is that in the general public is that we can do some really interesting research. We have a bunch of different questions that we're exploring at large scale. This paper here, I've cited because I'm going to skip over it and not going to talk about it, but the transportation people are really interested in how well does a crowdsourced system do, because these the formal systems where you buy the gear and mount it on a vehicle, for a city the size of Pittsburgh, it's going to be millions and millions and millions of dollars. So a quote unquote free or almost free service is very attractive to them. And we have some data on how well that works out. Now, since we started this project, it became politically possible for Port Authority to actually buy an AVL system. So now we're starting to look at the question of how do you merge this data together, because we have advantages that the onboard systems don't have in terms of data collection, but they have the coverage. And so we're looking at how do you fuse the two together. I do want to focus on a paper that is probably a lot more interesting to members of this particular community. We looked at the contribution effect. So the app that we have has a nuance in that we're asking you to contribute data after you've already gotten value out of the system. Once you're on the bus, you don't really need to have our app open anymore, right? It's kind of like, you got some data from us, please help out and chip in and help everyone else out kind of deal, as opposed to we're not going to give you data until you start helping us. And so there's literature and research out there that suggests that quid pro quo models work very well for certain crowdsourcing experiences. You see this in job sites, dating sites, that sort of thing. You can't see the job until you put your resume up. Those sorts of quid pro quo kinds of experiences. And so the question was, would this sort of negative kind of pressure where something bad happens if you don't contribute, would this actually work in this kind of space? And so over 10 months, we did something that no app company here in the Bay Area would even consider doing. We willfully flirted with revolt among our users and assigned our users into one of three categories. One category was none, same as usual, just worked the way it worked, no changes. The third was request. If you used a bunch of data and you crossed the threshold in terms of how much you used versus how much you contributed, we had two different thresholds. They actually turned out to not be effect. You got a pop-up basically saying, hey, why don't you contribute? It'd be nice. Help out. Kind of a request type of a thing. In the third condition, if you cross this threshold, you were told you're not getting any data, not even the printed schedule data, until you start contributing. And we use a big, bold red blocked on every single impression. And we did this for 10 months, which is a really long time to do a study like this. But we wanted to see the decay. We wanted to see dropout rates. And you can't do that over the span of 1 month or 2 months. And so by doing it over 10 months, you can really see the effect of this. In the end, we brought it back to the control at the very end to see what finally happened. And the short story is it works. It does lead to people generating more data per individual. The downside is that people abandon your app significantly faster. Request had no impact. It was identical to control. You're all really good at pushing through buttons that have no teeth. Okay. But the quid pro quo really did lead to a lot faster abandonment of the software and some very colorful one-star reviews in the App Store, which is why our ratings are so bad. But that's the nice thing about being a research group, is that we can do these sorts of studies and we don't have investors yelling at us. In fact, our agencies are happy that we're doing it. So this is an interesting thing to consider if you're doing research. And a personal pet peeve of mine, every time I get a funding review request that comes back saying, why do we need to do this? Why does the federal government need to fund this research? Aren't the app companies doing this themselves? And the answer is no. There's no way they would do this. But this is the sorts of research that is fun. As an aside, if you ever run a study like this with thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of data points, most human studies, if you get a significant correlation, that means that you throw it in the paper because it's interesting. At this size N, we got a significant correlation on one of our things for a coefficient of 0.01. And a reviewer rightfully pointed this out to us. So as a team, we had to start thinking about what's a functional difference in terms of some of our results, not just a statistical difference. I see a hand back there.
Why don't you just force them to record?
Well, that was the quid pro quo case.
Oh.
Right, they would only get data if they contributed enough.
Yeah, but why do you even give the option to not record?
So you're saying, why don't we trace automatically in the background?
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens is, and this works great for Waze. I told you. This works great for Waze, works great for Google Maps. It does not work in transit. Many of you are probably familiar with the stacked bus phenomenon, where two buses of the same route end up right next to each other. Now you have a problem as to which bus are you actually measuring. The really nasty case is when you have buses that go over the same routes, where you might not be able to disambiguate the two different routes until a quarter mile has gone by, sometimes even longer. There's routes in Pittsburgh where they start downtown, they go all the way out to Oakland, which is a really long, it's like 10 minutes worth of ride, and then they split. And even there, they only split from six different routes down to 3 different, so there's a sort of the outbound trip problem where a bus, they all start kind of leaving the same way, but then they all start splintering out. You just don't know which bus the person's on. The other kind of really kind of nasty case, which is a little more insidious, is that if the schedule says a bus is coming now and in 10 minutes, but a bus arrives in 6 minutes, which one is it? And so there's these sorts of situations where you just have to rely on the human and the human's perception and their judgment to give you the data. And so that's why we can't do it automatically. We are thinking about how to do it. We've got ideas on how to streamline the experience, but a fully automated process is probably going to be really difficult to do and have really good coverage because of the complexity of the system. So as I said, we're now merging the AVL. This gives us a large amount of coverage, but this coverage has weaknesses. For example, you don't get anything about fullness. And the location on these buses is generally driven off of a GPS system, while your phone has GPS and Wi-Fi, so your phone has better localization capability. And so we're playing around with different methods for hybrid fusion of data. We're also going through a major redesign. I mentioned that dialogue is an important feature, and we're seeing that the report function, as nice as it is, doesn't really lead to a lot of change. So we want to go to systems that allow people to have dialogue with each other so people can help each other on qualitative things like the air conditioner is broken on this bus, and so maybe you might want to catch a different bus, or things like there's broken glass all over this bus stop or something like that. And we're thinking about how do you support dialogue between riders and riders, but also riders and agency. And this version hopefully will come out very soon. We also are adding in user accounts. We've had complaints from a number of our users where they've gotten experience running on their particular phone, and then they switch phones, and then they have to reload everything on because the nature of the way we've set up our IRB and the way that our app works. You're strictly anonymous on your phone, and so in fact, if you switch to a new phone, you have to set up everything all over again. So we're moving to user accounts. As a byproduct, that also allows us to start asking questions like demographics. Do you have a disability? What kind of disability do you have? Those sorts of questions. But we're still allowing people to use the app without a user account. We just restrict what they can do. So I'm going to switch gears to the robots project. And there is a crowdsourcing element to this too. But I'll get to that in a minute. I am going to talk very specifically about blind users, but many of the features and functions I'm talking about have a universal design characteristic in that they support people who maybe don't know the language in the particular city they're in. Maybe they have a cognitive disability. Maybe they're completely fried from flying into Seoul on a 14-hour flight, and they don't have a clue where they are, much less what time of day it is. These sorts of things come in valuable for a large number of users, but for this particular study, I'm going to talk about blind users. So guide dogs are a great solution for a large number of mobility challenges. If you're blind, the problem is that guide dogs are particularly expensive and much more rare than you'd think. It takes a lot to get it. A dog has to be a very certain temperament and go through a lot of particular training to be an effective guide dog for people who are blind. There are a number of smartphone apps that do support independent navigation around the community. They're very effective outdoors where GPS is plentiful. The moment you get indoors, things start breaking down. And there are some approaches and techniques that people have come up with for indoor navigation. My colleague Bernardine Diaz, for example, uses a Wi-Fi triangulation technique that's been quite effective. But you'd like to have the situation where the smartphone, a robot that behaves like a guide dog, or even a robot at an information desk, all are part of the same system architecture, sharing the same information with each other, so that information that is relevant in one particular part of the transit experience is shared across them all. A good example of this is you're coming into a new station, you don't know it very well. Your phone lets this, the system knows where you are because your phone says you're coming into that station. The robot meets you at the door of the train, escorts you through the station. Maybe you might need to stop to get some help from the robot in terms of manipulation capability. And then you're going to go outside and move on to wherever your destination is. But there's construction on the sidewalk outside. Well, you'd like all of these things to know about that construction so that the routing can be altered and impacted accordingly. Likewise, the particular station might be really hard to walk through certain areas at certain times of day because of crowds that move with rush hour or other artifacts like that. So you have to think about this from a systems level perspective, and how could crowdsourcing be useful in that particular context. So again, traditional HCI techniques. You start early with your concept development. You bring in a handful of people to test out some ideas, and then you flesh those out and build them into more and more robust systems that you then do some experiences with. How many of you know the Baxter robot? Guessing a handful of you. Okay, so this is a commercial robot designed for manufacturing sites where you have to teach a robot to do some small task and then move it on to another thing. And it's good for kind of manipulation and inspection type of things. It's great for working with people who are blind, because this robot is designed with almost no pinch points. You can put your fingers just about anywhere on this robot and not worry about your fingers getting pinched, which if you're blind, that's kind of a big deal. And likewise, it's a very compliant robot. If this robot's moving its arm past you and your head happens to be in the way, it hurts, but not like so much that you end up in the hospital. It just kind of bounces off you, right? It's like a clumsy neighbor. And so it's a relatively safe robot to be around, which is why we really like this particular robot for the purposes of our research. Now, I'll acknowledge this is not the sort of thing you would see in a transit station, but for research purposes, it's a great test bed for us. And so we're using this for the manipulation activities. So we're looking at a bunch of different interactions that might work well. The one I'm particularly interested in, I come from a cognitive human factors background, so I had to go through all sorts of training on mental rotation and conversion between verbal and spatial information. When I'm giving you directions on how to get out of this building, I might say you go through those doors, you turn right, you go up the stairs, do a U-turn and walk out the front door. I'm giving you spatial instructions at the same time I'm giving you verbal instructions. So you're getting redundant information in two different modes, and that actually makes it much easier for you to remember it. Now, sighted people just do this naturally. We just do it. If you're blind, not only are you not getting the redundant information, but you're not getting spatial information. You're getting verbal information. So now you have to convert that verbal information into spatial information and then work from there. And the technique that's used by most mobility experts with people who are blind is the blind person puts their hand out, and then the person who's trying to give them an instruction on where to go puts their finger on the palm and draws it while they're giving instructions. And so that's really cool and comfortable if you're dealing with someone who's really used to doing this. But if you're dealing with a random station agent or someone else in a transit station who might interact with a blind person once every 3 months, that can be very unnerving and uncomfortable. Grabbing a robot's hand, that's an entirely different story. So we came up with we worked on some of these concepts and came up with some scripted examples of robot behaviors, brought in orientation and mobility and other experts in terms of teaching people who are blind how to be independent in the world, refined our ideas, and then brought in people who are blind and had them grab the robot and try it out and test out some of these experiences. And now what we're doing is taking this particular direction-giving case and moving it up to our more autonomous capability where the robot's doing some path planning and then converting that path planning into gestures. And we're curious to see how this works out. Now, One of the things that came out of this is that was kind of unexpected. Again, we should have seen it coming. Is how do you describe a robot to a blind person? Okay, when you see a robot, what you see on that robot tells you a lot about what its capabilities are, what its affordances are. Someone was talking about affordances earlier today. What it's able to do, what is safe to do around it. These are things you pick up automatically when you look at a robot. If you're blind, none of that is there. So the description of the robot becomes really important, especially if you're trying to get people to feel comfortable about reaching out and grabbing it. By the way, there's some really bad ways that you can say it's okay for people to touch a robot. So we've been actually looking a little bit at this problem of how do you tell a blind person that it's okay to reach out and grab this robot and it has these capabilities. And we've actually been doing some online surveys with audio clips and so forth to look at that. Most of this has been driven from data and feedback that we got from the people who came in terms of their recommendations and suggestions. But that's a fun little project to think about, especially if you're dealing with populations that maybe don't have the perceptual capabilities that you have. What does it mean when they encounter your technologies? What do they need to know about what that technology is capable of doing? Now, the crowdsourcing element, as I said, you'd like to be able to take data from people who are out there in this transit experience and then feed that data back into the system. The example that I used earlier, the construction on the sidewalk. So what we've started to do is look at techniques for people to generate breadcrumb experiences around, so don't go this way, go this way. Leave audio notes at particular spots. Dumping all that data into an architecture that allows the same information to be used by the robotic systems as opposed to just a peer-to-peer phone-based system. But the idea is that this sort of stuff will be available to everybody who uses it. An important nuance is that you want that data to have come from someone that you trust, can generate and provide the data that is actually useful. If you're not familiar with people with particular disability, what seems like an obvious thing to you might actually be completely opposite of what they need or want. And so the idea is that you'd like to have some control over the sources. And so this architecture includes this notion of trusted sources. And there's a variety of different layers and levels to that as well. Do you just trust people you know? Do you trust other people who have similar needs as you? Do you trust people who have certain credentials and so forth? Now, we're still early in this project in terms of the robots project. We're not obviously deployed like we are with Tiasu, but we do have money in our budget for a second Baxter, and that Baxter will be put out in the world, and we will be leaving it there and letting people interact with it over time. And this is something that a number of us have gotten much more verbal and vocal about at Carnegie Mellon. This actually stems from a transportation program called Traffic 21, where there was a strong request by a local foundation to get technology out into the world and let it be used by the general public so they can take advantage of all the bleeding edge stuff that we're doing at Carnegie Mellon. And we want to do this as well in the robotics project. This is kind of an important detail to doing interesting work. The downside is that it's a lot harder. You have to work on longer time scales, and you have to be worried about things like maintenance, robustness. The system really can't crash. We were fixing a Tiramisu server bug on a Friday evening. You got to be willing to do this sort of stuff when you go out into the world like this. But you get really great data, and you can tackle questions that you just can't do in the lab. And so this is really a fascinating and fun way of doing research, and we're excited to do this kind of stuff. I want to leave time for questions. The standard sponsor slide with all the different sources for the variety of work that I've shown you today. And then some pointers to some of the web pages. TechBridge World is where the robotics stuff is based, and the Tiramisu app is based at that location. But I do want to stress and go back to that earlier comment as our stakeholders are really important to us. When you do want to do research that does work with a particular small user population that has very specific needs, it's really important to get to know that population and keep them involved in your research. It's really easy to make naive mistakes unless you have close, continuous interaction with those stakeholders. And I'm not just talking about people with disabilities, I'm also talking about the people at the transit agencies that we talk to. And with that, I'll take questions. Yeah.
What specifically is Baxter doing? So are you using
So-
an effector to
Right, so in the example with the directions, we have Baxter do this, it puts its hand like this, and it then does the path for you and walks you through it. It spins its wrist to do the turns and so forth. Interestingly, you can't just take you can't just take it and scale it down, because if I tell you to go that way 3 feet and then that way 100 feet, you could actually make the person fall over, right? You know, because they're trying to keep with the hand. So you have to do some interesting scaling effects to keep it safe.
And did you pop on a different end effector or not? It's like
So there's 2 end effectors. For this one, we close the gripper, so it's like a fat finger, almost like this. So there's an orientation to the finger.
one more. Do you think Rething's newer robot would be better? It's just the one arm, more. It's a lot smaller.
Yeah, so that is for that particular task. Yeah, I mean you could use a much smaller technique. You could even make your own custom thing for it. We are using this particular robot for a couple different reasons. The first is there's other concepts out there. There's other functions out there that are probably valuable to people with disabilities. And by having a system that's more capable at the higher end, our research won't be bounded by that, by the technology we have at our disposal. It will still be bounded, but it won't be as bounded as it would be as if we had specialized pieces of hardware. The Baxter is actually, I mean, in the mind of a student, it doesn't seem cheap, but in the mind of a faculty, it is actually cheap.
Very cheap.
So, yeah. Other questions? Everybody's ready for
Really?
Friday? Everybody's thinking about their trip to Korea? Hope you like kimchi. Yeah.
So when you guys came up with the idea for tiramisu and all of basically the experiment that you did with the quid pro quo,
Yeah.
how did you compare that to? So obviously, you know, people are happy that you're doing that because you're doing research here. But how do you compare that to industry, and how can you actually apply that research you've done to efforts in industry and in the tech industry and startups?
Sure. So when we first started doing tiramisu, and I think Rafay, you probably remember this too, there was discussion actually of doing gamification techniques, positive reinforcement for contributing. And that's where a lot of the research area is in. You know, so there are certain contexts where quid pro quo makes complete sense. These dating and job sites and so forth. But most people who work in a space that's more, you know, casual, transient, short-term type of experience tend to focus on these reward-based systems, mostly because of organizations like Foursquare kind of showing that it can be quite effective in motivating people to do things. So positive reinforcement is a very strong and well-known effect. But at the time that we started the study, nobody had really tried negative reinforcement in these kinds of casual, kind of less high stakes experiences, right? Dating and job sites, that's a very high stakes. There's a willingness to expend a certain amount of effort to contribute to get what you want. But in this sort of thing, it's a more lower stakes, casual type of experience. And so we felt that it was important to explore this just to see, you know, because the feeling was it's probably a bad idea, but maybe it wasn't. And so it turns out that it's a mixed result. If you really care about contribution, you really want a lot of contributions, then yeah, maybe you do a quid pro quo approach and you just are willing to sacrifice your user base. But in other cases, you might not want to do that. And in our case, we don't want to do that. It also biases any study we do from now on. So that's why we turned it off, but yeah.
Well, so did quid pro quo really get people to contribute more, or did it just...
The per capita contribution rate was high.
But you sucked out all the people who weren't going to contribute a lot. Right? So the only people left in your sample were the people who contributed a lot. Whereas there are lots of people who...
So the red line is quid pro quo. I apologize for the look that it has here. So yeah, so this is how many days did they use the app?
Yeah.
So right, so you see that it doesn't suck them out as fast as you would think.
Yeah.
They decay faster, but you don't have that kind of cliff that you would expect to see. And that's kind of an interesting result too.
Yes. I think I was asking slightly different.
Now I'm sure there are a handful of users who opened the app, saw blocked, and said, "Oh hell no," and walked away.
Right.
Right, but
I guess what I'm wondering is, it seems like it would be possible that.
and by the way, people were assigned at first time they opened it, so it wasn't like they started in control and then moved in. It was at first instance.
So these were all new users.
All new users.
So I'm assuming what's going to happen is that there are going to be high performers who are going to record no matter what you do,
Yeah.
which is on most social sites.
Right. We have that curve. Yeah.
And then you have people who are basically like lurkers in a positive way. Like
Right.
they find value, but they just don't. They're not going to
Right.
contribute.
Right.
And so if you take these people and you say you got to contribute, basically the people who are more likely to drop are going to be the lurkers, right?
I think you are probably correct about that, but I don't think we actually explicitly did that analysis. We are doing, so we recently introduced the ability to make a contribution just by spotting a bus. So a bus is passing and you say, I saw the bus pass. And we're doing an analysis by comparing that to the traditional tracing technique and seeing the effect. In that one, there are differences in the groups, but we're actually seeing pretty common behaviors across the board. That paper will get submitted soon. But that one, we're seeing kind of, it affects everybody. But that's a different kind of thing. That's that's changing the effort, not so much the negative cost.
Sorry, so
Yeah.
the only point I was making, which I think you already get, so
Yeah.
apologies, it's just
Yeah.
if you get the people who are lurkers more likely to drop out, then your average of participation is going to go up. Because the people left are the high contributors. So
Again,
I
I don't remember, this paper is like 2000, we did the analysis in like 2011. I don't remember exactly, or was it 2012? Doesn't matter. I don't remember exactly, but I don't remember exactly if we looked at that particular data point.
It would be interesting to see
Yeah.
whether people contribute sort of minimum plus epsilon, or if they, did you just sort of like create a minimum wall that everyone just tried to pile barely over, or did you actually?
We do have anecdotal evidence that some people did just do that, where they just stepped over the line and they figured out the right technique for doing that. We did do an analysis of this particular question you're asking about, but I don't remember if it's in the paper. That paper was really dense. We had to we couldn't include everything. I saw a question, yeah.
I was curious if you had any comments or thoughts about tiramisu relative to Brian Ferris's work on One Bus Away.
Yeah, so One Bus Away. So Brian did that work with Kerry Watkins. Brian was the coder and Kerry was the transportation person. I talked with Kerry a lot. I've actually tried to get funding with Kerry together to do some cross analyses between One Bus Away and tiramisu. Haven't been fortunate to do that, to get that money yet, but we do want to do some collaborative work in terms of comparing things that are happening in One Bus Away and things that are happening in our system. One Bus Away is running in New York City, and when we're ready to, when our system is advertised in New York City, then we'll have a common data set because One Bus Away is not running in Pittsburgh. And that will be a really interesting thing to be able to do at that point. But we haven't gotten to that point yet, mainly because the resources haven't been there to do it. But yeah, we do want to do that. And Kerry and I, occasionally at various conferences, will sit down and scheme on things. Yeah.
I'm interested in kind of in route exploration and,
Yeah.
and in your data, could you characterize people as maybe explorers, or are they kind of doing a satisficing thing?
Right.
Especially if like a route change happens, that seems like an exogenous shock that seemed good for that type of exploration.
So, in the impact on riders with disabilities, we do have some qualitative data suggesting that the app did support exploration and awareness of new routes and new trip opportunities. We're in the process of seeing if we can tease that out in the quantitative data, but we certainly have qualitative data. Kerry Watkins, in her work back in her thesis work, did show that when you do provide people with real-time information, they do tend to walk more and people, and you think that this is the case where it's like, I'm waiting for the bus, but I could walk that same trip. Well, it actually is also things like, oh, the bus stop a block away has a bus that's coming sooner, I will walk there. So there is evidence that these kinds of apps do lead people to become more aware of options that are out there. Most of this is survey and qualitative data. We're hoping to figure out if we can tease that out from the data from this particular study. Not entirely sure if that's possible, but we'd like to do that. We are looking at travel behavioral patterns and trying to understand some of the details related to that, but that's more looking at how people move through a system as opposed to does the software allow them to do more things. Now you'll notice we don't have a trip planner in our app. Our app was explicitly designed for commuters. So the two kind of core things that came out of our app is we wanted to support independent travel by people with disabilities in the city using universal design techniques. For example, the iPhone one is voice over compatible. But we really wanted to focus on daily travel. And daily travel is typically very, very much, you know the route you're going for. And so that's why we didn't spend any effort in putting in a trip planner. Again, we're a research team. We don't have millions of dollars of VC funds behind us. So we just focused on that. So we don't have that sort of discovery tool or interaction built into the software. But some of the other apps that do that, that would be an interesting question. I think Carrie might actually have some data on that. I don't know for sure, but I suspect she might. I'm going to give him a chance because yeah.
In your control data set, when doing the basically the contribution testing, roughly, could you give a rough estimate of what your contribution rates you were getting on average, or is that?
I think I have that table on here. So devices is kind of like users. If you think about the likelihood of someone deleting the app or getting a new phone in the middle of the study, relatively small. So you could think about that as devices is kind of analogous to users. And so what you can see is in the control case, we're seeing about a 15% of the time type of experience. But in quid pro quo, it goes up higher. So, yeah. But that 17% is not significantly different from the 15, even at this sample size.
Is that ever like per day or?
That is a percentage of. I'm trying to remember exactly which this table is. I think this is, and you'd have to double check the paper to see if I get this wrong. I believe that is the I think that is the. You know what? I don't want to say because I think I'm just going to refer you to the paper because I might be getting that wrong. I might get this wrong because in some of our research we're finding contribution rates near 10%, but in others we have different numbers depending on how we're measuring contribution for a particular study. Yeah. So I don't want to say that because I might be giving you the contribution rate based on a different study. So I don't want the metric used in a different study. So I don't want to say because I might get it wrong. So that's the. That's this paper, the Tomasic CSCW 14 paper. He had a question. Oh, she. I used to have long hair, so.
I was wondering about, you were talking about with communication for directions, and you have sort of the auditory information and physical information, and the sort of that the repetition helps people remember the directions better.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, you talked a bit about if they don't have those sort of physical directions. Is that also the case, like, maybe if they're deaf or something, like they have sort of the physical directions, but they don't have the auditory directions?
So, so for deafness, it's a little nuanced because it depends on how they interact and how they communicate. So a person who lip reads and speaks, they're going to be analogous to a hearing person in terms of the using the verbal channels of the brain. There is some evidence that sign language does go through both the spatial and the verbal parts of the brain. So that's a little bit more of a fuzzy one, but I suspect it's still very heavily in the verbal space. Yeah. The thing complicating this is that sign language does have a spatial element to it. So that one's probably a little fuzzier. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, now you
Good,
can.
sorry. This is
Yeah.
maybe just a low-level system, but I'm thinking about your contribution rates, and it's like 10 to 15% or something like this. And you could ask, is that good? Right. And I wonder, like, maybe this is Anthony's paper, what kind of contribution rates would you need if you wanted to have, like, pretty good coverage, for example?
Okay,
Like,
so
I'm just wondering what the...
this particular paper is an interesting paper because what we did is, again, we looked at 10 months worth of data. Under a traditional notion of coverage, you think of all the possible trips, and a trip is a bus route at a particular time. So, the Caltrain that's running up to San Francisco and stopping at the station right now, that is a trip, okay, as opposed to a route. So if you look at all the possible trips and all the possible stops over an entire transit system, we're talking, it's a huge number because they're multiplying against each other. Our coverage rate is horrible, right? But because we're crowd-based, we do better where people are, so therefore the right thing to look at is when you pull up the app and you see and you look at like where and when people want data, what is our coverage rate for that? And that number is much better. And that's the way that we think about it from the perspective of performance and value to the end users, as opposed to the total coverage question, which is actually really relevant to a transit agency. But to actual riders, it's less valuable because you don't particularly care about the bus that goes out to Half Moon Bay at 3 p.m.
So coming back to that question then,
yeah.
Do you need more contributions or are you okay?
It's always nice to have more. Standard computer science response, I always want more data. We intentionally did not advertise very much in this particular thing because we're looking at some other studies with decay and that sort of thing. So we probably could generate more than we have. We actually did do a quick little study where we put ads on buses for the app just to see, how much we got back, and it did in fact, increase the quantity of downloading and an uptick in our respective contribution rates. But I think the right answer is that you could look at are you providing enough data to your end users to give them the data that they want, and then if you're not, where do you advertise and how much do you advertise to push that number up to a level that you want. There's a big question about, do you reach a critical mass at a certain point? So when you have a lot of coverage, does contribution go down or does it go up? And this is a hard question to answer because we're not really at the level where we were at that point. Now that Port Authority is rolling out AVL, that kind of gets close to that. And so one of the questions we have over the next few months, and again, we do kind of over long time scales, is to look at whether or not our contribution rates go down now that AVL is available. And we're still kind of too early to do that study. I think to do that analysis because we don't, in my opinion, we don't have enough data yet. Because I want data in the scale of tens of months as opposed to like 1 month or 2 months. Yeah.
Last question.
Oh yeah, I checked the paper. It's like the contribution rate was the fraction of days that they contributed versus.
Okay, days, not actual sessions.
Right.
So in this paper, contribution rate was measured by sessions. So in a session, did you record that? Because we're assuming you had a session at a bus stop that you were waiting to get on a bus. Did you then contribute? And this one was the 10% across the population. But that one is different. That's the number of days that you contributed. And I remember now why we use days. We use days because we were using days as a function because of the decay rate and things like that. Yeah, in that particular paper.
Over the number of days that they use the app, so it's like weaker than sessions.
Yeah, so the thing with sessions is like you might open the app in the morning. You might not open the app in the morning when you're going to work because that bus is almost always on time because the time of day that you catch it. But in the evening, it's really, maybe it's not always on time because you got to wait for it to work its way all the way out of the city to pick you up. So sessions is relevant for some kinds of analyses, but in other cases, like if you're looking at decay over time, then days makes more sense. Yeah.
All right, let's thank our speaker one more time.